Sunset is a Hungarian film directed by Laszlo Nemes. It follows a young girl who goes to Budapest to try and find work in a hat store that used to belong to her family. But mostly the film is used to explore the time period and attempts to chronicle the downfall of the or at least the beginning of the downfall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and of a certain type of aristocracy and bourgeoisie in Europe. Now, in terms of craft, the film is absolutely gorgeous. It's beautifully shot. It's fantastically well put together. However, I do feel the film is pretty empty and soulless. It's almost verging on parody of what a Cannes auteur film can be at times. But that's not really what interests me here. That's not really what I want to talk about. What I'm more interested in talking about is an element of the film that's actually only tangentially related to the film in and of itself that really made me despise it. But for that, I have to go back to 2015 and to Laszlo Nemes's first film, which was Son of Saul. So if you haven't seen Son of Saul takes place in Auschwitz, in the death camps. If you're unaware, the representation of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust, of death camps, in cinema is one of the most interesting and the most contentious philosophical debates that exist within the academic world. One of the earliest examples that I know of about this question of how do you represent the death camps in fiction in particular can be illustrated in a pretty remarkable article written by Jacques Rivette, who was a French filmmaker, but at the time he was still a critic for the Cahiers du Cinéma. He wrote an amazing piece on Guido Pontecorvo's film called Capo, which took place in Auschwitz, or at least in a concentration camp. The article is called On Abjection, and I've left a link in the description below to an English translation, so you can actually read it for yourself and see what you think about it. But essentially what it dives down to is that he absolutely detested the film on the sole principle that it was a gorgeously shot, very beautifully put together film about a subject that is probably the darkest period, or at least one of the darkest periods in the history of humanity, and you just can't represent that by having this gorgeously well-lit, beautifully shot, Hollywood-style, very glamorous film with a dolly in on a dead body, with the perfect amount of pan and tilt to go up to the hand, and essentially mythologize and glamorize this horrific event. And ever since then, really, every time there's been a fictional film on the Holocaust, there have been a lot of people coming out of the woodwork to say, hey, this film is actually very questionable on an ethical scale. A very early example of that is in the 90s when Spielberg released Schindler's List. Claude Lanzmann, who was the director of probably the most important documentary ever made on the Holocaust, which is called Shoah, he wrote an article or appeared on several talk shows saying how abhorrent he felt the film was, what is something that was in his mind unrepresentable, that cinema, in particular fictional filmmaking, could never truly get right. Now fast forward to 2015 and the release of Son of Saul. And what's super interesting about what Nemes did in that film is that he seemed to provide an answer, at least maybe a solution, to how do you represent the irrepresentable? How do you show what should never be seen? He arrived with a formal proposition. One was to shoot 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio so that the screen wasn't super wide and you could not show what was going on around the main character, and the other was to shoot extremely close-up or, medium close-ups, and always at a 35-40 millimeter lens with, I imagine, a pretty wide aperture, so that way the background was always out of focus. And so anywhere you put the camera, the frame was almost entirely filled by the main character, and then what was in the background was completely soft or out of focus, and so you never actually saw what was going on. It was all suggested through blurriness in the background, which you could then interpret, or through remarkable sound design. So Nemes used the actual medium of visual storytelling in order to arrive at this idea of, I don't want to actually show the horrors that went down because I don't think one can accurately portray what went down, but I'm going to suggest them. And Lanzmann himself was very impressed by this proposition. He even said, shortly before he died, that this was finally the first fictional film that represented the death camps in a way that he deemed accurate, in a way that he deemed respectful. On a personal level, Son of Saul is one of the most powerful and testing cinematic experiences that I've ever had to sit through. I distinctly remember being really in shock during the entirety of the film, and while it was coming out, it was pretty late at night, and I was hungry. I had about a 15-minute walk to my apartment, and I didn't want to deal with anyone. I just didn't want to see anybody, so I didn't get any food. I just walked straight home. I got up to my apartment and I just sat in my couch for a solid 30 minutes, and without being able to speak, without being able to do anything, I was just so drained, as if I had ran like a marathon or something. It was absolutely exhausting, and that just proves what a success the film was, because that's exactly the kind of response that it was supposed to elicit. And so here we are now, a few years later, and Laszlo Nemes's new film comes out, and I go to see it in theaters. And what do I see? Well, the film uses the exact same aesthetic proposition that was used in The Son of Saul. Why? With Saul, there was a creative and ideological motive behind the style that the film took on. But why is it exactly the same in this case? Granted, the film is maybe not exactly as rigid in its formal aspect as it was in Son of Saul. For one, it's not shot 1.33, it's shot a little bit wider. But that being said, it's extremely similar. Again, why? There's no reason for this film to be shot this way. And what it says to me is that maybe this director that I gave so much credit for having made this incredibly thoughtful, artful film about the Holocaust, well, maybe he's not that thoughtful. Maybe he's just a stylist, and this is his style. It just so happened to fit perfectly with what he did before. And now that the actual context in which he sets his movie just isn't as powerful and as draining as it was in Son of Saul, well, Sunset just felt like a whole lot of nothing. And because of that, it became absolutely unbearable. It's almost to the point that I question my initial reaction to Son of Saul. I almost feel bad for having been so swept up and so emotionally drained by that experience. I feel ripped off. I feel like this director lied to me in a sense. And I know this can sound like a very strange thing to get hung up on. Like, why are you just judging this film based on this director's previous work? Filmmakers, what they do doesn't exist in a vacuum. And now I feel like this director that I respected so much after his first film maybe doesn't have anything to say anymore. And even worse, maybe he didn't have anything to say. It just so happened that he got lucky. And that just is a really horrible feeling to have, and is why I spent the entirety of the film absolutely despising it. Despite the fact that, from a craft point of view, it's masterful. I mean, his director of photography is incredible, the actors are great, the sound design is perfect. It's almost too perfect to the point that it's extremely noticeable how good it is, which sounds weird, but I really have nothing to say about this film other than that everybody that worked on it did a really good job, but in service of a vision that I feel is absolutely soulless. So as always, thanks very much for watching the video. If you like the review, be sure to hit the like button. If you're not subscribed yet, please consider doing so, and in the meantime, see you next time.